Hello everyone and welcome back to another deck profile video. I'm Matt, also known as Plandana, and today we are looking at probably the silliest deck I've built in One Piece, which is Uta. Uta comes from the film Red promo packs, and her ability is an interesting one. You can activate main once per turn, pay a single Don to give one of your characters with no base effects plus 2000 power during this turn. And what that means is any character that has no rules text on the card can benefit from this effect. This means characters that have abilities and characters that have triggers cannot be used with this ability. However, counters on the side of the card are fine. It really makes you approach deck building in a different way and use cards that probably seem like filler everywhere else and you might not even pay much attention to. So what we're running in this deck, we'll start by looking at the vanilla cards I've chosen to put in here. We'll start with our 1-drops. We have 4 copies of Sunny-kun and 2 copies of Komachio. Now these cards, stat-wise, are exactly the same. One cost 3000 power and counter plus 1000. The reason we're running more Sunny-kuns than Komachios is because it has the Straw Hat Crew subtype, which synergizes with a couple of things we've got going on, namely the 1000 Sunny, so we can get some extra value out of that. Really, we're hoping to get one of these cards down as soon as possible because we can immediately power it up to 5000 with Uta and start attacking at our opponent's leader as soon as possible. Moving up the costs, we have a full 4 copies of Sai. Now, most of my experience with Sai was seeing him used in the demo decks from the One Piece tutorial events. I never thought I'd be putting him into an actual list. But 4000 power for a cost of 2 isn't that bad. He does have a counter, and so he just fits in well with what we're trying to do with Uta. We also have a couple of other cards that really like cards that cost 2 or less, and so that's why we've got the full 4 copies here. We are then running 2 copies of Nico Robin. She has base 5000 power, so can always attack at your opponent's leader even without a boost, but with Uta goes up to 7000 power, which is quite nice, and has a counter on her too, which is very important. I think that's a deciding factor for a lot of the cards in this deck is do they or do they not have a counter. Robin is just a fine card to be able to drop in your early turns and get some attacks going on later. And the last of our set of no effect text cards is Frankie. We are a full 4 copies of Frankie because he has 6000 power for the low cost of 4. There are other cards that meet this criteria, but again I looked at card types and elected to run Straw Hat Crew as it has synergy with other cards. Frankie is going to be one of the main attackers for this deck. If we can get him out, he's quite a significant threat, and with Uta can be 8000 power coming in every turn. Having a base 6000 also makes him slightly more tricky for our opponent to attack back over, which is the weakness we face with some of our lower power cards in the deck. Now, one thing I found that really ties this whole deck together is Nami. We have 4 copies here of the starter deck Nami. She lets you attach one of your rested Don cards to your character or leader once per turn. This is perfect with Uta. Uta gets to use one Don card to power up one of your cards, and Nami lets you still attach that Don, which really makes it less of an investment to activate Uta's ability. Getting Nami is key in this deck, and I would honestly be willing to simply mulligan just to find Nami, because the advantage you get from her is so good, and we have such a low curve in this deck anyway, you can afford to be a little bit more aggressive with your redraws. Another card that I thought was kind of interesting that I'm running in this list is 2 copies of Hyogoro. This card you can rest to give 2000 power to another character. We're already playing around this strategy of powering up an individual character to make it too hard for our opponent to counter, and Hyogoro does this nicely. Very importantly, he can do this on the turn that he is played, so you can immediately get some value out of your 2 Don investment. And if your opponent decides to attack over him, it's not the worst thing in the world, because they've left the card that you're using to attack anyway. He's also quite useful later game with the Namis, as Uta can't boost them up, but Hyogoro can. He can provide this boost to any character or leader you have, which is good for finishing things off. Now, one of the reasons so many of our cards cost 2 or less is because we have a full 4 copies of Jinbei. Not only is Jinbei a 5,000 power blocker, but he also has Don times 1 on block. You can play up to 1 red character card with a cost of 2 or less from your hand. This means Hyogoro, Nami, Sai, Sunny-kun, Komichiro, all of these cards can just be brought into play for free when you block with Jinbei. And at 5,000 power, it's still relatively easy to protect him with counters. This is a good way to make sure our opponent doesn't get ahead of us if they're also playing an aggressive strategy. Now, of course, we do still need some finishing power in this deck. We can't just beat down with vanilla, so I am running 2 copies of Rush Zoro. 5,000 power that can attack immediately when you play it is very, very good and can get some real good swings at your opponent. It's especially effective if your opponent has been trying to play around your board. It can be a surprise attacker that they weren't prepared for that forces them to make plays they're not too keen on. He's also my favourite character, so I'm going to try and put Zoro in every deck I play. A couple of other cards I run just because they work well with Zoro and what we're going on is the Uta from the main set. Now when she comes into play you can return a red character card with a cost of 3 or less from your trash to your hand. This is quite a useful effect to have. There's some good pieces you can get back. Sadly not Jinbei, but being able to get a Zoro back into your hand, immediately play it and get an attack can be quite good in the late stages of the game. We also have a lot of cheap vanillas that we may want to throw away for counters. We can recycle them and get them back, especially any plus 2,000 counters that you can keep putting back into your hand. Speaking of plus 2,000 counters, we have 2 copies here of Sanji. This Sanji is a good aggressive card. Now, you want to be careful with using him, which is why I only have 2. Getting multiples, you're going to end up losing too much life for it to be worth it. But being able to add a life card to your hand, get 2,000 power and put 2 Don on him means a 7,000 power attack coming out of a 2 Don and 1 life investment. Is a very strong aggressive card that can early game turn things in your favour and get you far enough ahead of your opponent that you can close it out even once they try to stabilise. Another way to try and finish the game off is, of course, Rush Luffy. This card is extremely good. 6,000 power with Rush, and if you can attach 2 Don to him, he cannot be blocked either. It's just a huge, huge finisher that's really hard to play around. It's hard to predict this Luffy coming down. Your opponent needs to hold up a plus 4,000 counter in order to be able to deal with him, and oftentimes you'll be able to sneak a win out with this card alone. Another card that I never thought I'd put into a deck that we're running in Uta is 2 copies of I Smell Adventure Ahead. Now, this card feels a little weird, letting you return all your cards in your hand to your deck and shuffle it up, then draw that many cards. Kind of feels like you're not doing much with this and ultimately going down 1 card in hand, but we have a lot of vanilla cards that aren't going to help in certain situations, and we have a few key pieces that can really close it out. I think it's worth having a couple ways to simply shuffle our hand away and draw new cards, as we're so often going to have disposable cards that we won't miss. Being able to find a key piece with Rush when we're trying to finish off the game or dig into a blocker is quite a useful thing to do. So I've slipped 2 copies in here just to filter through our deck into our more useful stuff. I've been mentioning Straw Hat Crew Synergy, and the main one of these is 1000 Sunny. Only 1 copy, because this is not a stage you want to draw in multiples, and it's not essential to our strategy either. We have plenty of characters that aren't Straw Hat Crew, and we're able to get a decent power boost without it, but if you draw it, it is nice to be able to get an extra 1000 power here or there. I think if our leader had the Straw Hat Crew type, I'd run more copies because we're guaranteed to get usage out of it, but I'm fine with just the 1, and situationally the extra power can be nice. A card that I think is really great in any aggressive red deck is Diable Jambe. This card is just huge. You can choose one of your Straw Hat Crew leader or character cards, and your opponent cannot block it during this turn. Yet another reason to be having those Straw Hat Crew types in our deck. And its trigger lets you KO a blocker that costs 3 or less, which is very significant in certain games. But yeah, this card can really close things out at the end. Your opponent's relying on blockers. They might have expected you to attack with the unblockable Luffy. they're probably not expecting one of your other characters to suddenly become unblockable as well. Combined with Uta's effect to power them up and all the other ways we have to make characters strong for cheap, this card can really throw your opponent and get in some attacks. We're then just running a set of cards to defend ourselves and deal with our opponent's board. We have 2 copies of Gun Gun Jet Pistol and 2 copies of Red Hawk. These mainly serve as ways to deal with our opponent's stuff. Red Hawk also has a really powerful trigger effect and is one of the deck's main ways of defending itself against Kaido. Being able to give it minus 10,000 power and stop our opponent getting that final attack in can be enough to create the opening to finish the game. Especially if they commit all of their resources to trying to kill us, it just leaves them open. Then to further shore up our defenses, just to make sure our opponent doesn't get ahead of us, we have 2 copies of Guard Point and 4 copies of Bartolomeo. Guard Point is just a nice event card. 1 Don to give 3,000 power. No catches, no additional little bits of fluff, just a useful defense here and there, and worth holding on to. Your opponent will often play around plus 2,000 counters here and there, so the 3,000 is quite nice. And Bartolomeo is mainly just here to chump block. We can put him in for free with Jinbei, which is a nice bit of synergy, using one blocker to play another blocker for free. We're rarely going to get his ability online to power him up to 5,000. To me, it just doesn't feel worth the 2 Don investment. But he comes down, he soaks up an attack, and it can hopefully keep you in the aggressive race. So that is the Uta deck. It is definitely not the most powerful deck in the world, but it is kind of fun to play. If you're looking for a fairly easy strategy where you just get to relax and attack aggressively, this is a good deck to use. You're also likely to take your opponents by surprise. It's not a common deck to be played, and most people aren't going to be sure how to play around it. If you're into aggro, this is one of the purest aggressive decks you could build in the format, so I'd recommend definitely giving it a go. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, leave us a comment, and subscribe. Really helps tackle the YouTube algorithm, and thank you so much for watching.